producing more oil. You argue they might, but this is not something you can just turn on overnight.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is that this is an industry that's really been left for dead over the past 7 years since the 2014 volatility with Saudi. Secondly, it's a question of will. It's not a question of resource. But, we've had a huge boardroom and C-suite change over the past decade in this sector. The CEOs in the sector have been brought in to grow cash flow, to live within cash flow, and not to outspend no matter what. I think it would be very hard for a CEO to go to a board and say, I'd like to double my rig count today in response to the price volatility over the past 90 days. Continental tried that in the middle of February. They increased their CapEx by 10 to 15% this year versus last year, and the stock fell 10%. If you are looking for leading indicators that the market thinks that public oil and gas companies are going to increase rig count, you can look at the relative performance of Halliburton and Schlumberger versus the oil and gas companies over the past 3 months. They've underperformed. And I would say the second thing is that there is a question of capacity in terms of how quickly we can increase rig count. And the thing to know about that is that, in the Permian in West Texas, we're running at 90% of frac fleet capacity. Across the U.S., we're running at 82% of frac fleet capacity. So it will take time for us to be able to ramp. And then the last thing I would say is, permits are up 45% versus a year ago, permits to drill new wells. So the industry can increase production, and there's a question of will, and then there's a question of does it matter? Because there's absolutely no way we can replace 10 million barrels a day of Russian crude. No one in the world can. And on the natural gas side, we can increase natural gas production. The U.S. is the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, but we can't get it to Europe right now, and that will be true for about 36 months.
Even if 1/10 of Russian oil is taken offline, call it 1 million barrels a day, Kate, I mean, that's a big ask for the United States. The world, of course, also looking at Saudi and UAE and OPEC as well. They've kind of remained silent on this. I mean, it seems easy to make a case for $125 or $150 oil like a lot of the Wall Street firms are now doing. Is there a case for lower oil? Let's say that something were to, quote, happen to Mr. Putin, as maybe the world is all rooting for right now, if you catch my drift, that this war simply ends. Is there a case for a dramatic drop at any point in oil and it will end when this war ends, or no?
Well, you can see that the political risk premium is back into the commodity. And I would say that 10 million barrels a day is unreplaceable. Saudi and OPEC Plus, which includes Russia, spare capacity is allegedly 5 million barrels a day. But we should be very, very afraid of that, because that 5 million barrels a day is a big question mark. It represents, in theory, 5% of global supply. But the OPEC Plus contingent underproduced 700,000 barrels a day in January, which is almost 1% of global production. So we are in a situation that now we're talking about energy sovereignty and security of supply and concerns around spare capacity. We haven't had those concerns for 10 years. And so in the context of what this means, it looks like we probably are talking now about Iranian crude, because there's absolutely no other crude that we could quickly bring on the market if we could bring Iranian crude on.
Yeah, and by the way, there is a lot of chatter that there could be some sort of Iran nuclear deal done, and maybe over this weekend, and that some of that may come back to market, but it's a lot to make up. Kate Richard of Warwick Energy, we really appreciate your time. Kate, thank you. Have a great weekend. All right, let's get now over to Randy Gibbons with the shipping angle of this war here. Randy, the one thing I know about ships is that they use a ton of fuel. They call it bunker. It's really kind of a sludgy diesel blend. I've got to imagine that the cost of that fuel has gone up. And when you're talking about, tens of thousands of gallons per ship on an already tight market, even before this war occurred, this has got to be incredibly inflationary for the shippers.
Absolutely, Brian. Hey, thanks again for having me. And quickly, before I start on the tanker bunker market, we here at Jeffries very supportive of Ukraine, raised $14 million for humanitarian aid. I personally, obviously, am praying for peace in the region. But as you mentioned, certainly a lot of impacts on tanker. Rates are surging, especially in the Black Sea. Bunker fuel prices, what propels the tankers, that's at an all-time high. So clearly you have seen a massive impact on rates, both from a dislocation demand component coupled with the supply impact. About 4 to 6% of the global fleet is now untouchable due to these sanctions. And then third, as you mentioned, the cost of actually operating and moving the ships with the bunker fuel prices now at $800, $850 per ton when it was $400 a year ago. That is certainly adding a lot of fuel to the fire when it comes to rates.
But we're also taking Russian oil offline. In fact, yesterday, Randy, we showed that the 8 ships, probably the last 8 for a while, that are still on their way to America loaded with Russian oil. That's probably the end of it, at least until these sanctions end, though. So how do we balance out the idea that Russian oil is going to be taken offline, but a bunch of Russian-related ships are going to be taken offline?
Yep. So what's going to have to happen is you're going to need to replace those barrels from further away distances, either here in the U.S. or from the Arabian Gulf, which also expands your ton-mile demand, making it longer and more difficult to get the same amount of barrels from Russia, now from the U.S. to Western Europe. So that also further increases tanker rates.
Are there any companies that are better positioned to weather this literal storm than others?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're used to seeing a lot of these geopolitical risks. We were on a year and a half ago with the whole missiles attacking vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. You know, in Matthew 24, we talk about wars and rumors of wars, but don't be troubled. You know, this too will pass. So when it comes to tankers, there's really 3 picks that we are most bullish on with this strong rate environment. First is Euronav, ticker EURN. Second is International Seaways, ticker INSW. And third is TK Tankers, ticker TNK. All of them have substantial Suezmax and Aframax exposure. And those are the types of ships that you've seen rates go up 3, 4, 5x just in the last few weeks.
Yeah, we're going to leave it there.